I'm Scott Marcus. I work for German Research Institute, the VIC. I'll be chairing the panel. My good friend Patrick Ryan from Google will be joining us. Ali Hussein, who works with Three Mice Interactive Media in Nairobi. Taylor Reynolds from the OECD, and Dr. Robert Pepper from Cisco Systems. So I thought it would be useful in this case to say a few words at the outset about what two-sided markets are and about how they've sometimes been used to analyze electronic communications markets, because I realize not everyone here is economists and probably not everyone here is really so familiar with the term. I know particularly the engineers may not have heard as much about them, so I thought it would be helpful to do a few quick framing remarks. Basically, two-sided markets are a relatively new branch of economics. They deal with markets that are two-sided or sometimes multi-sided, where a platform brings together the two sides of the market. They've often been used to analyze things like free-to-air broadcast television. Another example that's sometimes given are singles bars, where it's helpful to get the right number of men and women together in one place. But a noteworthy characteristic is that in a two-sided market, what's especially important is to get the right levels of participation and of usage. And so bringing together the two sides of the market is crucial. And sometimes that can lead to behaviors that would be irrational in a traditional single-sided market. There's an academic tradition on this that goes back a bit of a ways. The real breakthrough paper, in my view, is a well-known paper by a group in Toulouse in France. It was a paper by Rocher and Jean Tirole. It was published in 2004. There are many sequels to it over the subsequent years. They put together a lot of very useful ideas into a good, digestible form. In broadcast television, free-to-air television, which again is one of the best-known examples, usually it's the programmers, the senders, who are paying, and the end user, the consumer, the viewer, usually pays little or nothing. Now, again, to an economist, we look at this from a classic single-sided market view. We say, how could the price be less than the marginal cost? It makes no sense. But in a two-sided market, it does make sense. It brings the viewers together with the advertisers. Everybody benefits. So again, driving participation is key. Now, communication markets are in some sense always two-sided. And this was really one of the very useful observations. Oh, looks like we're not entirely visible here, are we? Well, if staff can do anything to improve the...
That's right, that's the transcript. Do you have slides?
Oh, the slides are up okay?
No, they're not.
Oh, they're okay there. They're okay on that screen. Good, thank you, sorry. So every market is a two-sided market, but a two-sided market won't always yield a different analysis than a traditional analysis. Again, what the literature gives us is some rules as to when it's likely to make a difference. Now, a couple of cases where two-sided markets have been used for analysis have been in voice call termination payments, and more recently in a fairly hot debate about arrangements between network content providers and network operators. Funding next-generation access deployment is another area where two-sided markets have been suggested as a mechanism to do it. On the termination side, again, it does have elements of a classic two-sided market. You've got, in the typical system, the so-called calling party pays retail system, you have payments going only to the originating network, not to the network that completes the call. But there's a wholesale payment, an adjustment between the two networks. The two networks collectively form the two-sided platform here. So it has been analyzed on that basis with results that I would say are a little less than fully satisfying. It turns out that the prediction from a two-sided market value would be if wholesale prices go down, as they have, you would think that retail prices should go up. If that were the case, these data, which show the wholesale and retail payments based on some third-party data from Merrill Lynch, ought to move in opposite directions, where in fact they obviously move in the same direction. So in these two-sided markets, a lot of different things can be happening at the same time, and the results can be difficult to predict. A little closer to home, the suggestion has been that content providers or search engines or what have you should be making payments to network operators. Important to remember, again, is that the platform here is probably not a single internet provider, but rather the internet providers altogether or collectively. Typically, a content provider, a video provider, has its own internet service provider that may be different from the one that serves the consumer, and the interests aren't necessarily aligned. This argument was probably best made by a 2010 study by a consulting firm, A.T. Kearney, that argued that those who benefited from traffic were those who produce it more so than those who consume it, and that those who have to build and operate the networks don't necessarily benefit this because the consumers are locked in at flat rate prices. Now, the argument here also was about exploding traffic and therefore rapidly growing costs. And so the natural question is, do we have rapid growth in traffic? Do we have rapid growth in costs? And these are empirical questions. This is a picture from the well-known children's book Alice in Wonderland. And those of you who know the books will remember that Alice seemed to always be eating something that made her grow or shrink. And we all know that uncontrolled growth can cause problems. So, that being the case, what do we have in the internet? Well, these are data from Cisco Systems. It's based on data from Cisco Systems, Dr. Pepper's firm. They do a well-known study of likely internet traffic growth over the coming years. And what we see here is growth. The upper graph represents the fixed network, the lower graph represents the mobile network. They're not on the same scale. So the mobile is still a small fraction of the total, but the percentage growth year over year in mobile is much faster than in the fixed network. In fact, in the fixed network, based on the same Cisco data, the growth is tremendous year over year, but in percentage terms, it actually declines year over year. So for me, as someone who's been in the industry for many years, I would have thought that the problems might have been greater 10 or 15 years ago when traffic growth rates were 100% per year. But of course, on a very different base, Cost trends also are more complex than one might think. Volumes go up. That's the blue lines here, go up over the years, but unit costs tend to go down for Moore's Law kind of reasons. These graphs relate to service provider routers and toward long-haul optoelectronic equipment, dense wave division multiplexing equipment. So you have opposite trends with effects that are different and that partly cancel. Yep. So some of the questions I wanted to queue up for today are, does a two-sided market analysis tell us anything useful here? Does it tell us something different from what we'd get from a conventional analysis? Really, on which side of a content market would you expect price signals to be stronger and why? Which kind of costs are really dependent on traffic volumes, which depend more on the volumes of users? And probably most important, and this is a question that also links very much to the critical resources discussion that many of us saw yesterday, what would the likely effect be of a two-sided market change in the structure of payments? Where would those payments end up? Who would benefit? Who would be hurt? Would there be net gains or net losses? And those were the questions that I wanted to turn over to the panel. So with that said, why don't we proceed next to Dr. Patrick Ryan of Google, and I'll give you a few minutes for each of the panelists to make their opening structuring statements. Patrick, you can start.
Great, thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm happy to be here because as Google, we obviously are one of the principal parties in this discussion in terms of using using infrastructure. There are a lot of claims about over-the-top companies using the infrastructure of other companies, the telcos that that provide service to the end users. And this has, of course, generated all this concern. It started back publicly in 2005 when Ed Whittaker, the CEO of AT&T, declared that, I'm not going to let Google use my pipes for free. Now, interestingly, AT&T has completely backed away from that position, as have many other world telcos, and there's really a split among telecommunication companies in this particular view. Hi, Luigi. Thank you for coming. And so we are, we're looking at a real sincere debate around, to some extent, around business models on the internet, but also to some extent, and I think this is an important point that's underemphasized about net freedom, right? I mean, these are commercial arrangements at stake. Ironically, companies like Google and Facebook and Amazon, big players on the internet, can afford, theoretically, to make contributions to, in addition to the many billions of dollars that are paid in transit fees in order to be able to access the internet already. And in addition to the infrastructure capital contributions that are made on an annual basis. For example, Google invested $3.5 billion in infrastructure and transit investment last year in 2011. It's a non-trivial investment. But what of the smaller users? What of the companies that are developing in the garage today? The next Google that may come from a garage in Nairobi. Where do you draw the line? At what point do you say that large companies should be paying, but the smaller companies should not until they reach a certain point of success? It becomes a very tricky thing, and potentially, if this were put into place, would in fact lock in the internet and create a situation where the large providers like Google and Facebook and Amazon and the companies that everybody knows today would in many ways lock in their position in the where they are, and that would significantly affect the ability for new entrants to come in and to be able to speak their mind. And so I just would like to suggest, and I'd like to hear some comments from others today, that there is, in addition to the commercial issue, an issue of net freedom. If we start putting tolls on the internet, not just for large companies, but for other speakers in the internet space, this could really significantly affect the way the internet is used in the future.
Next, Ali Hussein from Three Mice Interactive, Nairobi.
This is an interesting discussion, and I would like to really talk about it from an African perspective, specifically Kenya. To a large extent, I would like to concur with the sentiments that Patrick has talked about here. But I think the biggest issue here is, whilst a lot of the telcos really do have a point, I think sometimes, from a Kenyan perspective especially, the telcos who are talking about this kind of are a bit schizophrenic in terms of how they engage in this area. So on one point right now, we've got a huge debate about mobile termination rights. You've got Safaricom fighting with the other smaller telcos because they have the network effect. But on the other hand, they're fighting a stealth war to try and influence the Kenyan position on ITRs, which are going to be happening in Dubai. Now, from a perspective of I would like to give an interesting example of a small startup in the gaming industry in Kenya. It's a company called Mathui Resa that is based on the taxi operators in Kenya. And this game has become very interesting. It's become phenomenally successful. It has, over the last 6 months, it has been downloaded in about 200 countries, as far as Mongolia. People are downloading it and playing it. Now, asking a small startup like that to start kind of paying a toll for usage, I think is going to be you know, a serious issue that we have, you know, from a regulatory and competitive perspective. It is something that we must face. As you look at the telcos, yes, they have an issue because there is huge investment that, you know, is actually being put. So, you know, our question in Kenya, we are asking a lot of the telcos is, can you come together? Is this a case for a multi-stakeholder engagement? Probably with government, because we may not have the same kind of deep pockets that American and European telcos have. So I think really that's my statement on this issue.
Thank you very much, Ali Hussein. Okay, our next, Taylor Reynolds from the OECD. I know that you've looked at all of these issues. You've looked at internet interconnection and particularly some of the developing country issues with IXPs in that context. You've also looked at the MTR issues, so very much welcome your thoughts here.
Thank you very much. My name is Taylor Reynolds, and I'm an economist focusing on the information economy at the OECD. The OECD has done quite a bit of work on two-sided markets, and we have three specific requirements for something to be considered a two-sided market at the OECD. The first is that you have two distinct set of customers who need each other, and they're serviced by a platform in the middle. One of the other things that's important for us to keep in mind is that there are externalities, so things that happen in one group, are going to affect people in the other group in terms of what we call these externalities in economics. And then finally, one of the things that I think is the most important is that the platform itself, the price structure that is set by the platform, is non-neutral. And that means that changes to the platform, the way that pricing is done, is going to affect the level of transactions across between the two different groups. So these two-sided markets are quite common in telecommunications, and one of the things that we've seen recently is that you have to be careful with the way that you regulate these types of markets, because you need to take into account both sides of the equation. You need to look at all the groups that are affected by the platform, and you can't just make rules that affect one side without it having repercussions on the other. One that I would point out is exactly what Ali has brought up here about mobile termination rates and termination rates in general, because we've seen some countries in the world that are interested in raising the price of termination, particularly mobile termination, as a way to raise revenue in their countries. But because you're in a two-sided market here, what this means is it's going to have repercussions on the other group and across the whole economy. So, for example, we've seen recently that Ghana has increased the price, termination rates when you call into the country, and we've seen a drastic decline in the number of telephone calls that are coming into the country. So the reason this is important as well is because, as you all know, the internet is becoming a fundamental infrastructure for the economy. And if we start playing around with things without considering the full ramifications of these decisions, we can end up in a situation where we're actually hurting the economy for a little short-run gain. And I think that's all I have to say for now.
Thank you very much, Taylor. Next, Dr. Robert Pepper of Cisco. I'm sure that you'll have some thoughts about the data, and I know that you've thought a lot about these issues.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks for the organizers of the session. So let me go back to Scott's discussion or presentation about two-sided markets and try to make it very concrete and practical. And I'm going to talk about four very concrete examples of two-sided markets in communications, and you'll recognize them, and they're actually very pro-consumer, pro-competitive, and create value across the entire value chain. The first one is the Amazon Kindle in the US. So those of you who are not in the US may not be as familiar with it, but of course Amazon has its ebook reader, and you buy books and they're downloaded to the Kindle so you can read them. Most people, the average consumer, has their Kindle and they buy a book at whatever the price is that Amazon decides. Amazon determines the price of the book with the publisher, and it magically shows up on the Kindle. People don't think about how it gets there. How it gets there is Amazon has a commercially negotiated relationship in the US with AT&T to use AT&T's mobile network. So it's using their 3G network. You buy the book shows up. The consumer has no idea how it gets there. They don't care, right? They don't pay AT&T something extra to deliver the book. They just buy the book. The relationship on delivering the book is between Amazon and AT&T. It's a great example of a two-sided market that the network operator, AT&T, loves. They get paid for the transmission. Amazon loves it because they get to sell a book and it shows up, and you love it because the book shows up. You bought the book. It's a commercially negotiated economic relationship that outside of any regulation, because the prices in the U.S. for mobile service is not regulated. A second example of two-sided market that everybody's familiar with is toll-free calling, right? So you want to call your airline, and there's a number for you to call, so you can make a reservation. You can call this from anywhere. You don't pay for the call. The airline pays the network operator for the call. People love it because they can call to make their reservation, or any toll-free. I'm just using a reservation for an airline, or it can be shopping. It can be any toll-free. But the business with whom you are transacting business, whether it's an airline or a store, or if you're calling, Cisco for customer support, we pay our network service provider for the call. The customer does not, but the customer benefits. Again, great example, two-sided market. Everybody's happy. There's huge value across the value chain. A third example was an experiment that Bell South ran in the United States in the early days of broadband before it was merged. It was acquired, merged into SBC, which then became AT&T. And in those days, broadband, your basic broadband package in Bell South territory was 768 down and 256 up. But when you went to the home page, there was something called Turbo Zone, and you could buy a movie. It was a streaming movie that you could watch. Now we sort of take these for granted with video on demand. But with a 768 down, 256 up, your broadband connection couldn't support the streaming movie. So what they did was, when I bought the movie for $5 or $6, whatever it was, and they were experimenting with different price points, the movie distributor, the studio, paid Bell South to increase my downstream bandwidth to probably 3 meg per second for the duration of the movie, so that I could watch the movie, right? And then at the end of the movie, I went back to the package that I paid for on my broadband. Again, across the entire value chain, it was, the consumer loved it. There's a movie they wanted to watch. The studio loved it because they paid to boost the quality of service of the network for the duration of the movies. They got paid for the movie. Bell South liked it because it was an additional revenue stream, commercially negotiated. These are all examples of where the network operators could benefit, the content providers or the businesses benefit, and the consumer benefits. So these are the types of arrangements that I think of as very concrete in this space. And then there's a fourth example, which is and this goes to some of the points I think Scott laid out in his sort of the more theoretical discussion of two-sided markets, and that is this notion of, quote, cost causation. I mean, and typically in the traditional telecom world, we would look at, where is the causation, and it's kind of almost a silly concept, but it's one that's withstood time. If I make a call, I'm causing the cost on, for the network. I pay for that. Well, in the internet world, if I'm a student in Cote d'Ivoire and I want to take a course from Stanford University, which makes a lot of its courses available online for free, they go to the Stanford University website, they click on it, they want to watch the movie. Or not the movie, they get the course, which is essentially a downloaded or a streaming video. Now, the question is the cost causation the Stanford University sending the course, or is it the student in Cote d'Ivoire who has requested the course? And that's why this concept almost is not really relevant, because it's again, there are multiple parties that benefit. What we have to be careful of is that we do not end up having unintended consequences of having arrangements that are not commercially negotiated and mutually beneficial across the value chain that could result in that student in Cote d'Ivoire not having access to the courses they want. On the other hand, there's not a commercial negotiation or a commercial relationship that's been worked out between Stanford and the networks. Last point I want to make goes to this question of calling party pays. And one of the things that we've learned, and in the mobile world, right? When Scott and I were at the FCC and we were developing the rules for mobile operators and how they interconnect with one another and how they connect into the local network, the industry, not the regulator, the industry initially developed an economic model that was not calling party pays. It was essentially a bill and keep regime where the wireless operator paid for airtime. And initially, there were people criticizing that model in the US, saying, oh, it's, people don't, they're not going to use their cell phones. They're going to, people turn them off or because they have to pay when somebody calls them. Well, it turns out, empirically, that turned out not to be correct. And in fact, the bill and keep regime in the US for mobile led to the creation of a different business model. And that business model was a business model with very large buckets of minutes where there is predictability on what my cost is. And in fact, at the margin, for every minute I talk on my mobile, it's free, as long as I'm within my basket of minutes. And as a result, mobile users in the US for many years actually had at least 2 and in some cases 3 times the average minutes of use of mobile customers in Europe, Asia, anywhere else, precisely because there was a predictability of what their bill would be at the end of the month, and that drove a huge value. It also overcame both the economic theoretical and practical problem, which, by the way, we actually looked at and tried to resolve at the FCC, and that's the problem of termination monopoly. And the problem there, which is, again, it's an important economic question, and nobody's been able to solve it. I can have 6 operators competing, 10 operators competing for my business on the originating end. I get to choose my operator based upon the package, the service, the price, the quality of service, a whole range of issues or of variables. Once I select my operator, when Taylor calls me, right, in a calling party pays regime, his network has to pay my network, and there's no competition on termination. Therefore, that is one of the unintended consequences of that, is that because of the termination monopoly problem, we see very heavy-handed regulation in countries regulating mobile pricing and these wholesale relationships in countries that do not have a bill and keep regime. In a bill and keep regime, right, my mobile operator, all of these companies competing for my business, they keep the money, right? But because there is no incremental cost to terminate, because I'm paying for the termination, right, there is no monopoly on termination, and therefore pricing is not regulated. What it also did that was very effective in the US was it allowed the operators to internalize roaming to the network. So my local calling area in the United States is the entire country, because it doesn't cost my mobile operator anything more to terminate a call, whether it's locally or across the country. So, and we looked at this as a theoretical economic problem, but that has very large economic consequences for the industry and levels of regulation. And I think what we're moving towards, what I would hope we're moving towards across, as we migrate the entire industry ecosystem, is moving away from regulation to much more commercially negotiated arrangements, that we're not going to have regulators regulating either the wholesale or the retail prices, because we'll have sufficient competition and the right market structure and incentives that will take care of that. But we do have to worry about ensuring that there's value across the entire value chain, and that all of the players in that value chain actually have the ability to receive revenue from the different pieces, but it should be commercially negotiated. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for a very, very clear and incisive intervention. One question back to you, if I might, while we're on it. You'd raised cost causation as an issue. Now, Cisco obviously does a lot of analysis of trends, and I know one of the more striking trends in the VNI in recent years has been the huge ramp up of video traffic. When we look at cost causation, clearly a question is what fraction is initiated from the sending side, so to speak. Say, for example, if there's a huge Microsoft fix, one might argue that that's launched from Microsoft, or that the customer has limited ability to intervene in it. You could argue that one the other way too. Do you have a sense as to how much is initiated by the end user?
Yeah, sure. First of all, when I get a patch, not just from anybody, I get my updates. Those are relatively small amounts of data. I mean, relatively speaking. What we're forecasting, and by the way, with our forecast, it's a rolling 5-year forecast. We've done this for 6 years, so we've actually gone back at the early years of the forecast, and we check what actually happened. So we've been able to do that for 2 years now. And we're within 10%, but we tend to be on the conservative side. So the data, it turns out, are highly reliable. We're very confident in the reliability of the data. What we're forecasting for both fixed and mobile traffic, excuse me, is between 67 and 70% of the traffic is video. Now, video does not just mean movies. Video in multiple configurations. It can be short form video, YouTube video. It can be video to my flat panel television at home. It can be FaceTime on my iPhone to your iPhone. So it can be two-way video. That has different characteristic requirements. Right, that requires low latency and symmetry, whereas if I'm downloading video, it's different than if I'm streaming video. So there are differences in the types of video, which also have implications for notions of quality of service. quality of service is not just higher speed. Quality of service includes download, upload, latency, jitter. I like to actually talk about networks fit for purpose, and we need the networks, and where the technology is going is having adaptive networks, so the networks know the application, the type of application that's coming across the network, so that the network characteristics. If I'm doing email, latency is not important. If I'm doing voice over IP, it's really important. And you have to have the ability, and what we're doing now is have the device be able to talk to the application server. And that's important because if I'm watching a movie on my iPhone, right, I only need maybe 100K in terms of pixels, right? But if I'm watching it on my big flat screen TV, I want at least 1,000,000 pixels. I want a megapixel. So if they're sending it if it's one size fits all, if it's only being sent for my big flat panel TV and I'm watching it on this, I have to throw away 95% of the bits. On the other hand, if it's being sent for this, it's going to look terrible on that. So there needs to be, sort of this adaptive nature as well. And this is, again, the kind of thing where I think that there are opportunities for commercial arrangements between network operators, content providers that are mutually beneficial to be able to provide these new kinds of services and new business models completely outside of regulation.
Yes, Taylor?
I'm sorry, all this talk about video, I thought I would jump in with a little story of my own personal life. I am not a very popular person at home right now because I live in France, and my ISP currently is at heads with Google about the delivery of YouTube traffic. So my ISP is asking for Google to spend money to upgrade the connection internally in their network so they can deliver video. My ISP says no. Google says, well, it's not our business if you can't deliver the content. And so what happens is YouTube videos in my house will load about 40% and then they'll stop. And you wait and you wait and it will buffer and it will go a little more and then it will stop. And my kids, my 10-year-old daughter is going ballistic because she can't watch these little videos that she likes. So we are considering switching ISPs. So I'm in the process right now of probably switching ISPs next week so that we can go to a provider that has this arrangement worked out. Now, the reason I think this is important is because in France, there's a competitive telecommunications market where I can actually switch providers and not pay a lot more money, and I can actually get it done right away. So I might have to wait a week or two for the actual transition to take place, but I can switch providers without some huge cost. And what that allows me to do is vote with my feet. I can say, I'm not happy that you didn't come to a commercial agreement between the two parties, and therefore I'm going somewhere else. And I think that's the sign of a healthy market, and that will help keep things in check. And it's one of the reasons that telecommunication regulation, making sure that markets are competitive, is extremely important so that we can let these two-side markets operate efficiently.
Yes, Ali Hussein.
I think I also want to add on to that. From a perspective of the Kenyan market, we are also seeing some very, very, very tough competitiveness, which is raising the issue because you've got service providers who are now going to the regulator for protection. And it's beyond the MTRs that we have talked about. You're finding that new ISPs are coming into the market who are offering 10 times the bandwidth at a fraction of the price of the current service provider who I have. So, much as the market is very fluid, but is there a question for a balance between regulation and market forces? Because I can tell you that a lot of the telcos and ISPs in Nairobi are bleeding red ink.
So I think we have a lot of thoughts here about win-win solutions. Tell you, I'm going to take the liberty of switching a little early. I know I've got one person who's enthusiastically asking pose a question from the audience. So can I take the liberty?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, I'll take the liberty of doing. Do we? Somebody have a mic? Well, tell you what. While we take care of the mic, let me take one more comment from a panelist then, and then we'll switch back to you. On this question of Kenya, I'm interested in understanding a bit about the distribution of payments within among the network operators. I think Kenya is one of the not so many places in Africa that has, for example, an IXP, an Internet Exchange Point. After this, I'll be interested in hearing from Taylor a bit about how that works in many other countries as well. But first, Ali Hussein, how do payments work, and how well do they work among the network operators in Kenya?
Payments?
Is it peering, transit arrangements? Can smaller ISPs get peering in?
Yeah. Okay. So in Kenya we have an organization called TESPOC, the Telecommunication Service Providers of Kenya, who have put an internet exchange point, and the Kenya IXP now has grown to become a regional one. So we are serving to some extent Tanzania, Uganda, and next online is Rwanda and Burundi. They will be all within the same IXP infrastructure. So for local traffic, basically, there are certain termination, agreements within the organization, because the majority of the players, you can't have access into the IXP without being a member of TESPOC.
Okay, thank you. Now, I know, yes, Taylor, I was actually going to look to you a little for how arrangements work in some of the other countries in the region, more generally developing and developed countries. The OECD, as many of you may know, recently published a quite interesting study about internet exchange points, a Weller-Woodcock study. And this has been a long-standing concern that in many cases smaller ISPs weren't able to obtain interconnection within their respective countries, had to effectively trombone their traffic outside. So sorry, Taylor, for that long introduction, but away you go.
Yes, this is actually quite a big problem in many countries in Africa, where precisely this is called tromboning, where if you are an internet user in Mali and you send an email to someone who lives down the road that might be on a different ISP, what essentially happens is your internet traffic, that email travels from Mali all the way up to France and then comes back down. So we call this tromboning, and it is extremely inefficient because traffic internally within the country can be very cheap, but as soon as you start using international transit routes to route traffic, all of your domestic traffic between operators is going through France, it becomes a very expensive proposition. That trickles down to higher costs for subscribing to the internet as a user, and what do higher costs mean? Fewer people connected to the internet. And then the next logical step is the fewer people who have connections to the internet, the less that the internet is a core part of the economy. So really, these are areas that we think are extremely important to address, and one way to do this is a very cheap operation, which is developing an IXP, an internet exchange point. I mean, these things honestly do not cost. They're not very expensive to set up. They can be between maybe $50,000 and $200,000 US to set up an internet exchange point where you have traffic exchanged between operators locally. One of the big challenges, though, with internet exchange points is it's not just the equipment. You actually have to have training of people who know how to do this, and you need to get all of the ISPs on board and show them why it's important to actually exchange traffic locally. But in the end, we at the OECD think this is extremely important to get as much traffic transferred locally as possible.
Thank you. Well, at this point, why don't we take a question or two from the audience, then I might move back to the panel. Jeanette Hoffman? Try turning it on.
I'm I'm a researcher, but no, I'm not an economist. I'm a political scientist. So I look at what you call two-sided markets as battles between various approaches to. So I look at it as a battle, and I've been I've been wondering how new content distribution technologies or services, how they affect the two-sided market, and which side of the battle the ISPs or the content providers actually benefit or get weaker or stronger in this negotiation of pricing.
Could you describe what you mean, Janet, by new content distribution models? Give an example. Yes, could you give an example of what you mean by a new content distribution model, just to illustrate it?
What I mean is new technologies that bring the content closer to the end user and thereby effectively reducing the whole cost of data traffic.
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. I think that one of the it's not really a new technology, but it's certainly a new process, is what Taylor was talking about, and that's this idea of internet exchange points. And the interesting thing for me about internet exchange points, as somebody that's spent 18 years in the telecommunications industry, is that they're just really not very well understood, even by experts. Before I joined Google, I had no understanding about internet exchange points at all. And so, this has been a learning process for me. I'm sure it's a learning process for regulators, but it's an absolutely key best practice for keeping that content local. The example that Taylor gave is great because it enables ISPs to exchange information within a particular region. It's also, I find, very interesting to sort of look at and study, and I think there's further academic research here that could be very valuable, the different kinds of business models for internet exchange points alone. In the United States, many of the internet exchange points are, for example, commercial in nature. They have a business of running an internet exchange point. It's for profit, and they run it like a business and facilitate the exchange between providers. But that's fairly unique to the United States. In other parts of the world, like in Africa and in Europe, the internet exchange points operate on more of a cooperative model. Where it's not a for-profit venture, but the members will, contribute and sort of, all be part of it as a cooperative. So internet exchange points is one key part. Another thing is these content delivery networks, right? And companies like Google and Facebook and Amazon and Microsoft have their own content delivery networks that they will bring closer to the user. And a lot of times they'll locate these in internet exchange points or in other nodes that are closer to the user. And there are other companies. There's even a third party, sort of a market that's developing for this. Companies like Akamai and Limelight that are providing this service for others that maybe not be able to afford their own model. This is something that we, as a company, are just now becoming more comfortable with talking about publicly. We haven't given any sort of a press release on this at all, but if you look online at peering.google.com, you can now see a map of many of the various different points where we will bring our content closer to users in various different parts of the world. And it also describes some of our company's philosophy on peering relationships and on what sort of conditions we would like to see in order to be able to bring that content closer to the user.
Yeah, Scott, on the CDNs, I mean, Patrick makes a really good point. These CDNs or content delivery networks have really come to the fore in the last 3 years, and there are traditional telecom operators now also that are providing CDNs. There are federations of CDNs that are evolving and developing. So again, these are all commercial responses to the huge demand that's being created. And again, they're called CDNs because they're content delivery networks, and most of that content's video. So it's not just the internet exchange points. In the U.S., you had public exchange, we call them exchange points then, right? The public exchange points, we had private, peering or exchange points. There are you know, they call them what, interconnect hotels, right? Some of them got flooded last week in Lower Manhattan, but it's where all the big network operators, you know, connect. Some of these are commercial negotiations and commercially supported. Some of these, going back to Scott's early days in the internet with May East, May West, the early interconnection points were actually, some of them were literally in university broom closets where you had these networks connecting. Now, it's evolved way beyond that, but the important point about internet exchange points is it keeps, one of the trends that we're seeing in order to bring retail prices down, bring down the prices of international bandwidth to the local operators, the local carriers, is you have to keep the traffic locally to the greatest extent possible. And it's not just tromboning on email, but it's especially in Africa, it's the traditional network configurations between East Africa, West Africa. If you were in Kenya and you wanted to send an email to Cote d'Ivoire, it went from Kenya to London to Paris, from Paris back down, because these were the old colonial telecom routes. That's changed. We now have much more bandwidth in Africa. We have multiple competitive undersea cables, the fiber networks. The big issue now within the continent is bringing broadband traffic from the coastal countries to the inland countries. And this can only be done through internet exchange points, keeping the traffic locally, regionally, but also what's important is having the bilateral relationships and negotiations so that you can get traffic from one country to the next and really bring down the costs of bandwidth to the local operators, because the local operators are having to pay huge amounts, very high prices for international bandwidth. So that flows through to consumers. It is happening, and by the way, the market's taking care of that, right? If you go back 15 years, that was the complaint in Europe. You sent an email from Paris to London, it went through Reston, Virginia, because the prices for interconnection and high bandwidth within Europe was too high, right? That came down. We had the same issue in Asia. The market took care of it. We now have the competitive cables surrounding Africa, and again, it's being driven down, and what we need to do is more of these internet exchange points and things like the CDN federations.
Thank you, Robert. Well, I think this would be a good time to open up for some audience questions. We've got about a half hour left, so we have enough time to take a few. Good. There, please. Could we get a microphone over? Please introduce yourself.
Yes, hello. My name is Carlos Cortez. I'm a researcher for the University, you hearing me? Of Palermo in Argentina. I have sort of a basic question coming back to what the gentleman of Google was saying at the beginning, and is like the relationship between the two-sided market concept and the openness of the internet. Because for people that are not working in the economy standpoint of the internet, it seems sort of a risk in terms of where is the business driving us in terms of the internet. So I really don't know whom to pose the question, perhaps to all of them. Exactly what do you think is the relationship between the two-sided market or the evolution of the internet business with all these concepts you have explained and the open internet and the capacity of people being able to disseminate any kind of content without being discriminated in the terms that we've been working it in freedom of expression, perhaps approach? Thank you.
Anybody inclined to take that? Or? I think.
You know, I am hesitant to answer because I just love this topic and I brought it up, but if there's anybody else. Yeah, well, I do think that this discussion is, you know, it tends to, people get lost in it when it becomes a commercial discussion, right? And we talk about, as you mentioned, two sides. You know, you're dealing with two parties at the table, but this absolutely has consequences for the openness of the internet in many different ways, because it's not just the users that don't think about, you know, how the content gets to them. They just want the content there. It's also the people that innovate. I love one of my favorite things about working at Google is the collaboration that I have with Vint Cerf, and the thing that he always talks about is the platform that the internet has created for permissionless innovation, and that really applies to small users. It applies. I love that example that you gave about the video game company in Kenya, and it just suddenly somebody had this great idea and it just blew up. Right, and it was able to blow up and able to grow because he didn't have to ask for permission. Whoever developed it, and then these products and services or just ideas and thoughts can continue to disseminate without any restrictions. And so it's not a connection that's an obvious one, but it's certainly the core of the internet is the ability for anybody to put anything up on the internet, have a commercial presence or not, and to be able to make that decision without having to think about the barriers to entry.
Thanks. Did anyone else want to jump in on that? Yes.
Maybe to just also add into that, I think we are also seeing an interesting evolution. Maybe it's kind of new from an African perspective, but I think this has been going on across the world. This whole concept of triple play. So you're finding now that telcos are not only offering telephony and internet connectivity, but they're now also offering content, TV content. So we have an interesting company in Kenya that started as an ISP maybe about 10-15 years ago. It has evolved now. It's called Wananchi Online. Wananchi stands for citizenship in Swahili. It's now moved to become the biggest triple play player in East Africa with a brand called Zuku. So you're actually finding even the competitiveness, rather the markets are becoming more and more blood. Broadcasters are becoming telcos. Telcos are becoming broadcasters. They are becoming content providers. They are becoming financial services providers. I don't know whether you have heard the story of M-Pesa, which is a money transfer, rather a mobile money transfer service. Kenya accounts for 70% of mobile payments worldwide. 70% of mobile payments. And this is from a telco. When M-Pesa was launched a few years ago, there was no regulation. Nobody had told a telco that they could start a money transfer, system. Nobody had told us a telco that they couldn't start a money transfer system. At some point, the banks tried to fight it through regulation again. So we are seeing again the issue about business models evolving to the extent where you're finding organizations running and hiding behind, forgive me for saying this, hiding behind the skirts of regulators for protection instead of evolving around market forces. So I think from my humble opinion, this whole two-sided market concept has evolved to an extent now. We were discussing this just before the session started. It's now becoming a multi-sided situation. Thank you.
Yes. Why don't we take another question from the audience?
We gotta get Luigi. We have to acknowledge Luigi here, who I think, I don't know if you all know Luigi. I'll introduce him briefly. He's the president of Etno and has been very vocal on this and has a very different view. And I think it's one that's worth hearing. And Luigi, I'd love to hear from you at this panel if you're interested.
Yeah, while the microphone is coming up, just one additional thing, responding to the last question. So there's some new business models, new technologies that actually are making it easier to entry, but again, there have been commercial development. So for new entrants, for small startups, you know, even 4 years ago, 5 years ago, you needed a relatively large amount of capital to buy servers, to get the processing you need to write code, etc. Now with cloud services like Amazon cloud services, you buy your processing, your computing as you need it, and the cost of entry by new entrants has plummeted, right? It doesn't mean that their computing is free. They pay for it, but because of the shared nature of this across networks, the ability to enter, the number of startups, the vibrant atmosphere now in Silicon Valley with small startups that start with almost nothing, because you can do it from your bedroom or your kitchen, and you buy your computing as you need it. You don't have to buy a computer or a big server. And so these are the kinds of things that actually are happening in these new market relationships and the new technologies that actually are reducing the cost of entry by the little guys, the new guys.
Thank you very much, Robert, for an interesting intervention. Okay, and at this point, Luigi Gambardella, chairman of Etno, would be very interested in your views.
Work? Okay. Thank you very much. Even if I'm here more to listen rather than to speak, and I think that this is a very important occasion, and I think it's very interesting such kind of opportunity that we are having in these days here. But I would like to make to comment and then to have your reaction on what I'm going to say. First, on the issue of quality of service, I think that I would like to clarify this point. And here I refer mainly to what Patrick was saying and Ali was saying. No one is asking money to the small over-the-top that is operating from Africa or from Kenya. On the contrary, we see the things in a completely different way. Because as Patrick was saying, Google is capable to invest, as is one of the few who is capable to invest, because he is an incumbent over the top. It's Google is very big and has the capacity to invest. And therefore they have the capacity to deliver content, using content network delivery, and to invest and to ensure that their services have a different speed, But what happened to the small over the top, to the new company, that they cannot make such kind of investment? And we as operator, we are not asking you money. We are not asking them money. We are asking, let's work together. And let's do revenue sharing. We will not ask, so this means that with the quality of service, we will allow even the smallest player in the market to offer new service to compete with other big players, and without making an investment, because we will do the investment and we will share with them the revenue, we will share with them the model. And so, on the contrary, we think that this system could create more competition and could allow small and new players to enter into the market and to be competitive and to offer new service. So this is the first point, and I would like to have your reaction on this. The second one, first I want to say that I agree 95% of what Robert has said, also because we have to thank what he did, he does, he's doing, and because Cisco also is playing an important role to demonstrate how this business is changing, the boom of traffic, and the reality of the changes that there are. But just to clarify 2 points. First, we believe in the private sector and we believe in commercial agreements. We are against any further regulation, just to be clear on this point. Second, as far as I know, Robert, in the US already the sending out or pay model already is a model that exists and is already implemented in the US. It's called a direct peering. I don't know. It's a form of direct peering. So if it's not imposed, is something that can be used. And another thing which I agree with you, the last comment that was from here. I have some difficulties to read from the person OECD. I think you made a very good point, and very important one. Choice of the customer is the most important thing. You are not happy, you change your provider. You are not happy, you change it. And you can do that in Europe. You can do that. And you know how many providers there are in France and in other. So, and this demonstrates that, and even you know that in Europe there is a lot of possibility to check the minimum level of quality of service, to go to the regulator. So, and I think that what you said is extremely important and demonstrate how important it is to keep such kind of competition. And this is the reason why no one has interest to lose customer, because we want to keep our customers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luigi. I think a couple of people on the panel probably want to respond to that. It's interesting because, of course, it echoes many of the points that have already come up in the panel discussion, including the notion of win-win and the notion of voluntary commercial arrangements. Anyway, Robert, why don't you go?
So I think your point about small content providers is actually extremely important, because that's why I made the point about the Amazon service, because the analogy here, and it's more than an analogy, which is just like, Google mostly builds its own servers, data center, etc. But the startup goes to Amazon to buy computing on an as-needed basis, right, as they need it. So the analogy, and it's more than an analogy, is that for a CDN, the large operators can build their own CDNs. Actually, the CDNs provided by third parties or by the traditional telecom operators are a huge opportunity and a sweet spot to create a new business relationship that benefits the new entrant that only can afford to buy CDN capacity, right? They buy it by the drink, not by the bottle or by the case, right? They buy it as they need it. So it's a business opportunity, and it's very analogous to what Amazon has done in the computing space with computing as a service into the CDN space. So I think that's extremely important. And by the way, there are operators that are doing that today. The second point you make about the sending network pays, those are commercial arrangements. That's, in fact, there are going to be all kinds of commercial arrangements. It's the regulatory mandate. In fact, I remember when I was at the FCC, Scott may remember this as well, we had mobile operators come to us wanting us to impose calling party pays. And we said, no, there's nothing that prevents you from doing it. If you want to do that, that's fine. We're not going to require it. Right? They ended up never doing it because the business model actually worked out better for them with the bill and keep. But when you're talking about commercially negotiated arrangements, there's going to be a wide range. The majority of the internet peering and transit relationships in the U.S., especially the peering, are not, the sending network pays arrangement. Although if you can think about sort of some of the paid peering or transit, I mean, you are, because there's an asymmetry in traffic. We can get into the whole peering thing, and Scott actually is one of the world's experts on peering because he negotiated some of the earliest peering contracts among the big network operators back in the 90s. But no, I think you're absolutely right, Luigi. There are, but that's what you want. You want the degrees of freedom to have this commercial negotiation.
Yes, actually, if I can offer a data point, since I was sort of invoked there. At the point when I was in industry negotiating agreements, I was doing that for GTE, which became part of Verizon, of course, and at the time was probably the third or fourth largest backbone in the world. About 10% of our private peering arrangements involved payment. 90% were settlement-free. So it's existed. It's existed actually from the very earliest days of the internet, but it's never been a dominant model. Okay, yes, Taylor, I think.
Thank you very much. I'd be happy to address Luigi's comments because I think they play right into this whole discussion about two-sided markets. One thing for those of you that may not be as current on what's going on with some of these discussions is that operators are saying, hey, we have to upgrade our networks and we need to pay for them. And it's true, there are network upgrades and they need to be paid for. One of the discussions going on, though, is if the existing revenues are enough, or more than enough, or not enough to cover these upgrades. And telcos have massive amounts of revenues coming in compared to companies like Google, other internet providers. I mean, they're very large, and the question is, who's going to pay for this? My fear, though, in terms of the two-sided market, is the proposals that are out there, some of them that have been tabled, are actually taking us back to a model that was the way that things used to work for mobile and fixed line telephony. And as I pointed out earlier in the day in this discussion here, it doesn't make any sense that if you pick up Skype and you make a phone call to the United States, you pay 1 cent a minute to call via Skype to the United States, but you pay 38 cents a minute to call Ghana. It is not more expensive to terminate a call in Ghana. That is a result of the structure that has been put in place by the government of Ghana to tax things coming in, and a cartel that's essentially been built in Ghana for mobile termination. And we don't want to go down that road in terms of the internet. It's a bad move because look at the people who are affected by this. It's not the Americans, like I am, who are paying 1 cent a minute. It's the diaspora that's calling back to Ghana and paying 38 cents a minute and can't afford to call their families while they're away. So I think we need to be very careful, and that's why the two-sided market, when you make changes and you think, I'm going to raise some revenue inside my government by putting a tax on mobile termination, what you're doing is you're actually affecting the whole ecosystem in ways that are going to be very detrimental for a country like Ghana.
Yes, Ali Hussein.
I would entirely agree with Taylor on this. I mean, we're already seeing a situation where we are starting to balkanize the internet. But I think, coming back to what Luigi said, I think my biggest contention here is, where do you draw the line? Where do you say that Mathui Resa, from a Kenyan perspective, Mathui Resa is a startup? Where do you draw the line and say that the telco in Mongolia, which they are downloading Mathui Resa, does know that this is actually a startup that may not have necessarily the money to make these to do this revenue share that you are proposing? I mean, hold on, Luke. I think the point here is the principle behind this. We need to be very careful. I'm not in total disagreement that, you know, the telcos are making investments that somebody somewhere must pay for. But we must be very careful how we structure this and how we get into a situation where we are actually putting these into government-related treaties that then become an issue where certain markets are going to be totally discriminated from a price perspective. So that's really, from a perspective of a guy who's coming from Kenya, who is seeing the kind of innovation that is happening, this will just kill innovation immediately. Those are the concerns that we have.
A couple of questions. Why don't we take that one first? Oh, you've got the mic. Go for it.
I'm just going to claim it as I have it. Thank you, Chair. My name is Wouter Nates. I'm a consultant from the Netherlands, but I would like to respond to Mr. Gambardella, I think your name is, that as an analogy, something which happened in the Netherlands in February or March of this year. Microprocessor chips are one of the biggest things driving PCs, etc. The machines that make them are being made by a company in a small village in the Netherlands, which is a world leader. And they could not afford to to invest the new generation of machines all by themselves, and the banks apparently at this stage of time were not willing to invest with them. They got their biggest customers so far that they bought 10% each of shares into the company, which the company can invest with to build the next generation machines that they deliver to Intel and others to make the chips they need 2 years from now. So in other words, that could be a model, and he's putting off his headphones, which is very bad because it's a message to him. But you better keep your headphones on, right? Because, okay, but he got customers invest into your companies to build the new generation network. So look to people like Google and Microsoft and Yahoo and whoever they are. Maybe they are willing to invest with you because they can deliver better content, etc. This is what I think they're called AMSL or ADSL or something, not ADSL, AMSL. And they actually did that. And as an ex-regulator, just one word on regulation, that we basically broke open the market in the Netherlands, and you can see through the years, step by step, the regulation went backwards, and innovation is all over the place, but with lower interconnection rights and special access rights within a few years, and we saw that the companies went way beyond the regulation ever envisioned. So in other words, regulation helps to break open a market from an incumbent situation, but after that, only regulate what you need to regulate, and I think that is the message.
That's a good message. Let's take a few more questions. If Mr. Gambardella has a comment at the end, I'll be happy to take it.
Hi, I'm Carolina Guerre from LACTLD. I think that in developing countries and in South America, Argentina in particular, there's the coordination costs involved in creating IXPs, for example, or the transaction costs that we would need for small content providers in order to be online and to have their services, that they would be huge. I mean, so I don't agree with Edno's proposal in that respect, because I don't think it helps developing countries at all, and I think we have to watch out for coordination and transaction costs in these developing markets. And in fact, if you see the broadband plan in Brazil, the national broadband plan in Brazil, the national broadband plan in Argentina, they are just being run by the government, because the oligopolistic market of the operating telcos is not helping that access go into the least central regions of both these two huge countries. So just these two comments.
Okay, good. Why don't we, the gentleman in the back, from whom we stole the microphone a while back, why don't we get it back to him now?
Thank you. I'm Ayman Salah from the International Center for Journalists, and I'm talking about for the CDN content that we need, and we can. Example for Africa, we tried so many times to provide content that it's an NGO content. It's done for good, or a disaster content that we are trying to help citizens with it. And in that case, we don't need to wrestle with operators about fees. We should have some kind of regulatory here to help these people to send their content to help other citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to want to do a last run around the panel. Luigi, was there anything that you felt the need to respond to out of those? I don't think that, I'm not sure you did, but you're welcome to if you wish to. You're okay? Okay, well, why don't I simply offer to the panelists then, do you have any closing remarks or wrap-ups? I know I've got some thoughts that I come away with from this. Sure. Patrick, first?
Well, sure. Well, Luigi, I'm very disappointed that you didn't say anything much more provocative. I was hoping that we would be able to maybe end this panel by having an arm wrestling match together for the future of the internet. Okay, all right. Well, let me just wrap up with my final comments before you do that. And I just wanted to say that I think this is an excellent exchange. You know, the idea of revenue sharing and having small businesses share business models, I think is a very good suggestion. And that's one that is available today on the market, right? Anybody can do that. Anybody can choose to enter into a revenue sharing relationship with any company, whether it's an ISP or a telco or any of the larger platforms. And that's the beauty of the market, and that's, again, I think speaks to the permissionless innovation. What we really want to avoid is having rules or mandates that require revenue sharing. And it sounds like we agree on that point, but I think that's just an important thing to emphasize, at least from my perspective.
No, I would like to first to say something, because otherwise we will give the wrong impression. We are friends with Patrick. We are not an enemy. And I have to say that also our relationship, not only between us, but in general with Google, are improving a lot. And the dialogue, the discussion is always good, is always important, because there is also behind a better comprehension of the situation. And what we have to understand, that this discussion is much broader than the discussion we are having today. Let's think about here we are a completely revolution. Let's think what's happening with the publishers, for example. How also the business model of the publisher has to change. It's changing dramatically. For the broadcasters, will be the same. So we are here. It's not only about telecom operators and Google. It's much more broad, and obviously we don't want to stop the future. The future, we cannot block the future. We have to understand, we have to adapt, we have to react, and we have to work in order to have a better internet for everybody in a way in which everyone will win, starting from the users. Because we speak too much about only about us, but we should always remember, first we should speak about consumer, user, and then about the industry, because what we need is a model that works well. And so I don't feel very far from you, Patrick, even if we can have different ideas, but we are here. And what I liked in this IGF, that has been said several times, we need to work together. And we are here to work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luigi. Okay. Moving around the panel, Ali Hussein.
I think for me, Luigi has just said what I really wanted to say, because this is an ecosystem, and the more I like this new American word that is being bandied around quite a bit, frenemy. So you are friend and enemy at the same time. You compete while at the same time you cooperate. So I think if we have this kind of arrangement rather, where you have not a win-lose situation, not a zero-sum game, but a win-win situation across the board, I think we will have a better engagement.
Well said. We also speak about co-opetition, by the way, cooperation and competition at once. Taylor?
Thanks. I'll be just very brief here. One of the things we didn't talk about are what are some of the government policies that could address some of these issues about investment. One of them would be we need to make network rollouts easier. So that would be investing in passive infrastructure that helps operators roll out their networks and lets these two-sided markets develop. And we also need to help develop content. We need to foster the development of content locally, and we need to keep it local. And governments need to do their part to put their own public sector information available online to increase demand for the internet.
Very good thoughts. Thank you. Robert?
I'll also be brief because based upon the experience of the last 2 days, 3 days, if we're not in line for food, they run out of food.
That's brief. Thank you. Okay, well, let me take the moderator's privilege of just trying to wrap up what I think we heard over the last hour and a half, though. We actually had, I think, agreement on quite a few points. So let me see if I can rattle them off. One was that this is an ecosystem as a whole, and that everybody has to make money, and that there's a need to look for win-win kind of solutions. Another point where I think there was broad agreement is the need for voluntary commercial arrangements, not for a regulatory solution. A third point that we heard at a couple of instances is that there's quite a bit that can be done to improve the system, quite independent of this two-sided market discussion. Everything from making sure that there's sufficient international bandwidth, internet exchange points, proper arrangements within countries, and so on. I think a fourth is sort of a broad concern about radical change to the system or imposed change to the system, unintended consequences, transaction costs, and so on. I think that's actually pretty much what I've got. As I said, a desire to try to find ways to move forward that benefit everybody and that don't radically shake things up.
Scott, I think that's actually a great summation, and I want to thank you very much for chairing. It was a great panel. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all the panelists and our extra panelist as well, Luigi. Thank you.